Process of digestion includes mechanical as well as chemical. And these mechanical process of digestion includes the chewing of the food in the oral cavity and as well as the peristalsis that is taking place in the stomach. And the chemical process includes action of enzymes on the food materials, converting the complex molecules into simpler forms. So first, the process of digestion starts in the oral cavity. In the oral cavity, salivary glands are present. Salivary glands secrete saliva, right? So this saliva contains enzymes. So the enzymes act on the food and the chemical process is initiated in the oral cavity, right? So the saliva has an enzyme which is called salivary amylase. Salivary amylase acts at a pH of 6.8. And what are the starches? The cooked starches that are present in the food are acted upon by salivary amylase and convert it into dextrins. We call them as maltose sugars. Next, mostly that means 30% of the cooked starch is digested in the oral cavity. Then also the saliva secretes one more enzyme which is called lysozyme, which acts as an antibacterial agent and that prevent infections, right? Next, this moistened food from the oral cavity by peristalsis flows through the esophagus and from esophagus enters into stomach. Once the food touches the stomach wall, right? So the gastrin hormone stimulates the gastric glands for the secretion of gastric juice, right? So already we have discussed the composition of the gastric juice. Gastric juice is composed of enzymes like an inactivated enzyme called pepsinogen and as well as HCl, intrinsic factors and others, right? So let us find out how exactly all this will work on the food. In the stomach, the food is stored for 4 to 5 hours. Next, the pepsinogen is inactivated enzyme. So these inactivated pepsinogen with the action of HCl is activated to active pepsin. So when once few pepsin molecules gets activated, pepsin can also act as an autocatalyst and convert other pepsinogen molecules into active pepsin. Then this pepsin acts on proteins and convert these proteins into proteases and peptones. So peptones are nothing but we call them as peptides, right? Then apart from this, the mucus and bicarbonates present in the gastric juice helps in the lubrication of the food as well as they protect the wall of the stomach from the excoriation of highly concentrated HCl. So this is one of the important function that is performed by your gastric juice. Because the HCl is highly concentrated, so from this HCl, the wall of the stomach must be protected. This is done by the mucus and bicarbonates. Next, there are small amounts of lipases are also produced by gastric glands. So we call them as gastric lipases. And generally, these gastric lipases acts on already emulsified triglycerides if any are present in the ingested food. Then only they'll act, otherwise they do not work, right? Next, one more interesting thing is that in infants have one more enzyme which is called prorenin, right? So this prorenin is an inactivated form of renin which is called chymosin, which we call it as prochymosin, right? Now this prorenin is activated into renin with the help of HCl. What exactly this renin is? Renin is critically important in infants. It was found that in prenatal infants, right, this renin enzyme is produced by the same your chief cells of the stomach wall or the gastric cells. The gastric mucosa have chief cells and those chief cells only produce this enzyme. So what is it? This renin enzyme performs some important functions. What is it? Number one, first it works on milk proteins. and convert this milk protein casein into calcium paracaseinate, which we calling it as curdling of milk, and then finally it is converted into protease and peptones. In the initial few days of after the birth, this particular enzyme renin works more. And then why the curdling of the milk has to be done? This an advantage is that due to curdling of the milk, due to coagulation of the milk proteins are converted into a solid form so that they can retain in the stomach for a longer periods where the process of digestion takes place. If the renin does not works, then what happens? There would be a rapid flow of milk into the intestine where it loses the initial process of digestion, right? Like this, when once the food reaches the stomach, in the stomach the proteins are partially digested into peptones, proteases and peptones, which are nothing but we call them as peptides, right? And already the carbohydrates are partially digested into disaccharides in the buccal cavity, right? So as a result, after the food, when it leaves the stomach, the food is partially digested with carbohydrates and as well as proteins are partially digested, and the food is moistened with the mucus in the stomach and it becomes acidic. Such an acidic semi-solid food in the stomach is called chyme. Now this chyme slowly with the help of pyloric sphincter reaches into the intestine, and where further process of digestion takes place in the intestine.